how they achieved this remarkable transformation, and looking particularly at the public policy drivers for that success. I don't know if you can see this next slide, but the darker line below shows you the approximate trajectory between 1990 and where we're heading to 2030 in sub-Saharan Africa, the rate of progress. And then the dotted line, that massive upswing, that transformation that's going to be required on sanitation if we're to get to everyone everywhere by 2030. Similarly, the blue line, South Asia, a quantum leap, a step change in performance, and of course, while the gradient is slightly less steep for South Asia, of course, the numbers are truly eye-watering. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people who will have to be reached over the next 15 years. Has it ever happened before? Well, we looked at South Korea on your left and Singapore on your right. Of course, in those days, there was no such thing as the JMP measuring improved access. But what we chose instead were proxy indicators. For South Korea, they measured their progress in sanitation by looking at helminths, by looking at egg infections. And then in Singapore, the proxy we used was at the final step of the sanitation ladder, those who are connected to the main sewage. So the main story is here, is you will see this dramatic upswing in sector performance in both countries. So this research asked, well, how did it happen? And the techniques we used were looking at some of the legislative instruments, looking at institutional changes, media interviews, and talking to some of the public officials who are responsible for delivering that remarkable transformation. And of course, with any sort of qualitative research, we are taxed or challenged by investigating past events. Everyone has this golden era, this view of the past about their own history. Everyone overplays their own agency. I'm sure if I was talking to some of the researchers who helped in water aid and beyond, I would probably come away thinking, well, it's all my agency in this. Of course, that was remarkable in delivering this research. Similarly, historical episodes, everyone likes to inflate their own part in it. And of course, these were atypical historical events. This was the Cold War. What part, for instance, did this intra-peninsular rivalry play in South Korea's development? What part did it play, this rivalry between Singapore and Malaysia? Similarly, we can't ever go back to those unique historical circumstances. But I think the other part to this, of course, is that in this unique historical episode, we were dealing with developmental states. So the question is, I think a lot of you will probably be thinking, great, this presentation now being delivered is an opportunity for me to go to sleep or to do my own thinking, because actually it's pretty stupid looking at East Asia. What can possibly be inferred or transferred from these developmental states to the context, the challenging context in fragile states in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so on. Well, we were kind of similarly perplexed by that thought, but here's an interesting set of figures. So this is the table showing you what the per capita income was of South Korea at the top in 1960. So you can see there that per capita, at least, South Korea was considerably poorer than many sub-Saharan African states at that time. And this was the moment, the historical time, when the leadership in South Korea decided to go for 100% universal access to sanitation. They made the public policy choice, the political choice during this period, to go for this remarkable transformation. So the point of this slide, I think, for me, it's really helpful because it challenges this unspoken assumption that you hear on the part of a lot of international policymakers that you get to 100% sanitation when you get to development. You have to arrive, it's the end point, it's the outcome of development. But the interesting lesson here is actually it was the critical central driver of national development efforts at that time. It wasn't thought to be seen as, if you like, the add-on, the final outcome, but it was centered to national development efforts. So reaching this per capita GDP threshold is not decisive, at least in making the choice to drive for universal access. Of course, there are a whole host of other initial conditions involved, institutional strength and so on. But I think it's kind of interesting that actually wealth is not one of those for at least making that public policy choice. Okay, so the big finding here, and let me go on to some of the findings now, is the political narrative. In London, it was driven in the Victorian period, it was driven by health threats, crisis. The elites, the children of the elites were dying from unsafe sanitation and so on. That appears to be one of the big drivers. But in East Asia, there were crises. So here is a fire in Singapore, quite a famous one that destroyed one of the slum kampong areas. But actually, when we look at the interviews at the time, the political narrative suggests that it was all about notions of developing a modern society, of integrating into a global economy, that it was about establishing the trappings of modernity. So clean streets, healthy environment, healthy citizenship, healthy workforce. And let me just read you a couple of sentences by Singapore's founding Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. It's kind of, I read these out because it actually says everything, I think, about his political motivations. And he says, launching the Clean Singapore campaign, he says, we shall establish better conditions of community living, norms, and which will make for a more pleasant, healthier and better life for all. These standards will keep morale high, sickness rates low, and so create the necessary social conditions for higher economic growth in industry and in tourism. So to make Singapore an attractive economy for inward investment, that cleanliness, the trappings of modernity were central. But there's one thing about that I think for me is kind of instructive about how we do our advocacy. Because in INGO advocacy, I think we're basically flawed. We do it wrong. And we do it wrong because we look for the markers of political will. We think, oh, political will, really important. Let's see a line, let's get a line in the minister's speech, in the communique, the presidential declaration. When actually, looking at the East Asia experience, there's something else about the leadership that seems to be critical, and it's not necessarily confined just to this political championing, but there is one more element to it that I think is absolutely critical. So it's this. So here you get the championing on top. This is Lee Kuan Yew speaking to all of these men, and they're all men, during, these are all public officials, and it is public exhortation, but this is a leadership that is intimately interested and engaged in the technocratic challenges. They want to know what is going wrong, why is it going wrong, and building in a cycle of reforms. So for instance, in South Korea, President Park Chung-hee actually had once every 2 years a presidential decree on sanitation. So he was constantly seeing what's going wrong and building in a reform cycle continuously. And for me, this, if there's one thing you can take away on this presentation, and you can now go to sleep because this is the central message, just wait for the central message, is that it is about course correction. It's about establishing a diagnostic capability and with adaptive management, building in a set of remedial policy reforms. And it's a continuous cycle. So these were countries that had no blueprint, they did not know what they were doing, but they just went ahead and tried everything, and constantly changing and reforming. Okay, so just before you go to sleep, there's one other element to this, and that's the integrated approach that others have spoken about. But the idea, maybe controversially, one provocative thought to throw out there, let's get rid of the idea of a sanitation sector, because in these countries there was no such thing as a sanitation sector. There was environmental health, or there was housing, or it was part of education, it was part of public health awareness raising. So maybe we are boxing ourselves as a sector into a ghetto by talking about us being in the sanitation sector, that actually we should break out now out of the foothills of our guerrilla warfare, if you like, and we should move out into infiltrate other sectors and integrate it in there. The way of doing it was really in East Asia, West Malaysia and Singapore, was the idea of multi-sector planning. Every sector had their own, came together and jointly planned, and then you had these vertical delivery systems in each sector. Okay, so this was a whole of government approach. It wasn't confined to a sanitation sector. And to give you an idea of how this happened, you can't really read the writing, unfortunately, from there, I guess. But this is the organogram, and because I'm in Germany, I'm using that Bauhaus function. Administrative form follows implementation function. And here, very much so true for the organogram of how the Environmental Health Ministry organized itself. So in the yellow, you see the software parts, the education, the training, the basically pushing out the message in all spheres. In the blue part, you see the hardware, the engineering sector, and they match and mirror each other. And another part of this that I kind of think is interesting is the seniority. And you see, this is just a snapshot, so take the top bit of that organogram, and that's blown up and magnified seamlessly for you. And you'll see that very high up is the training, education, communications branch. So this has an elevated role in the whole bureaucratic structure, a seniority there. And if I was to talk to Prime Minister Modi, for instance, in India, I would say, as many do, your toilet construction targets are fundamentally flawed, as we know from India's recent history. And actually, if we are to learn anything from East Asia, it comes from a very, very strong behavior change-led. That's at the leading edge of this whole public reform exercise. So, then let me just quickly, because I'm running out of time, I think, is that showing? Yeah, okay, so like any sector, sanitation has its gangs, and particularly for a marginalised sector, there are many gangs. Gang warfare, Ecosan, CLTS, or whatever. And I like to I'd like to form another gang. Maybe we can start today. It's called Total State-Led Sanitation, and that's kind of controversial. Maybe fighting will break out soon. But here the lesson, at least it disrupts this assumption in the sanitation sector that actually this is all about community mobilization and they will raise demand and so on. This was highly state-driven, it was subsidy-led, it was top-down, and it was about complete urban regeneration. In West Malaysia, there was a different set, because it's largely rural, a different set of drivers. But certainly in Singapore and South Korea, an urban story largely, it was fundamentally about urban regeneration. And then the other part is that it's top-down. Yeah? It comes with sanctions, it comes with punitive measures. And I love this expression, develop the necessary knowledge and habits for physical health development and maintenance, and to possess indomitable vigour. Yeah, I wish sometimes I had a bit more of that training. I'd been Korean maybe, and woke up every day with indomitable vigour. Okay, so let me just kind of, looking at, again, the public policy drivers here. This is the big story. Here are how they monitored outcomes. Yeah? So in South Korea, they monitored parasite infections. They are looking at the golden indicator straight away. They're not looking at numbers of toilets, but they're looking at outcomes. How are you going to measure your success? You look at outcomes. You look at health outcomes. That clusters toilet availability, use, the shit flow, everything, looking at those infections. But here's a significant difference with these other three. So with the other three, this is this point about diagnosing what's going wrong. So monitoring is not quite the right word, because monitoring suggests we all look at, oh, the graph is coming down, oh, it's going up, it's going down again, and so on. It wasn't tracking. This was monitoring as a diagnostic process, establishing what's going wrong and where. And the most interesting one for me is in Malaysia. So it's at a local level, intersectoral operations rooms, fantastic sounding name. And the midwives were first used to monitor household behaviour changes, so at a household level. And I'm just going to give you this quote from the Deputy Prime Minister, because it just sounds fantastic. He says, development teams must also at least once a week have what I call morning prayers, where all development officers get together, and instead of writing tedious minutes on files to each other, and you can substitute emails for files, they settle their departmental differences together in a coordinated way in front of the maps in their operations rooms. So I love this idea of everyone sitting on a map, and then you can spatially understand what's going on, where, and so on. But it is intersectoral even at a local level. And the other bit that I haven't got time to go to, because I'm about running out of time, is this idea that they had this high levels of subsidiarity of decision making. So despite it being top down, actually when it came to the implementation tier, they had huge amounts of discretion in terms of public policy choices and implementation. And on the basis of difference, they were encouraged to bring that up to ministerial level. Okay, I sent this to Ben earlier a couple of weeks ago, and he said, oh, that's all very good, yeah, but can you say something about Citywide? You know, that's what everyone wants to hear. So I'm just going to flip through this, because this is rather tokenistically what I am doing to satisfy him to pay for my hotel room. And that is, so how do we transpose all of that learning to the citywide, the urban domain? And I just thought it was quite interesting what a colleague of mine is doing with architects in WaterAid. But I think that the idea here's the city of Maputo in Mozambique, and the idea is basically to layer maps on top to build up this multi-dimensional picture of a transformation at scale. So this isn't piloting, but this is big bang change. And just here are some maps in the great colours. So housing, housing again, planning challenge, and then they're looking at overlaying transport, and then they're looking at water, and then sanitation proposals. So they're actually saying, okay, this is the way we could run it. And then finally, the risks to climate change. So I'm just going to so if one is to think, how does one do that in a citywide domain? I think this idea of multi-layered mapping is one really interesting way to start to think in a more strategic, holistic way. And I'm sorry for those of you who are planners or architects, this is probably self-evident, Room 101, but to me it was, hey, that's really good. So let me just finish then with a couple of pointers, maybe that, so strategy to achieve universal access by 2030. So where results are process, mechanisms and system improvements more than numbers. And I say that because there's no one here from the UK who can report me back. We in WaterAid, we get money from DFID, and let me tell you here, it is the wrong money. It is providing huge disincentives to us being involved in a creative system building agenda. It is about us producing numbers, a bit like Modi's government, you know, 1 million here, 1 million there. And it is leading to questionable results, questionable sustainability, and what we need to do is collectively, I think as a sector, to fight back to donors and to say that approach doesn't work, it doesn't produce sustainable results, and we need to get onto that transformational agenda. We need to invest in institutions, systems. So we need to change indicators to system building.